Okay, thank you everyone for joining us for our history and culture of the Washoe people. This is Herman Fillmore, a representative of the Washoe tribe. So I'll let him take it from here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mi umwanga wa mibi washu elu Eliza digam dia lai the boy elu Herman Fillmore digam dia lai. Gila Laura Fillmore digam dia kei ashti boy Benny Fillmore digam dia kei. Dia ama Bernita Snooks digam dia kei dingam del Palele Gita Demaya Maria Luisa Fillmore digam dia kei. Bawalu de day lai ash bawalu umdanu shilu lai. Ashwadi washu de dumushimu wewish. So hello everybody, welcome. My name is Herman Fillmore in Washoe. A lot of my elders, at least from the immersion school, they still call me Eliza, which is my Washoe name. I always joke that the only people that call me Eliza are the elders that were at the immersion school or somebody when I'm in trouble. So I don't hear that name a whole lot, but I do have a few friends that use it. My parents are Benny and Laura Fillmore. My paternal grandmother is Bernita Snooks, and then my wife is Maria Luisa, and my son is Del Palele. I am currently the Culture and Language Resources Director for the Washoe Tribe of Nevada in California. I'm from the Carson Valley. I'm of the people of the valley, which is one of the kind of four bands, as they're described, of the Washoe Tribe of Nevada in California. And that's where I grew up. I live in the Dresslerville Reservation, and I was previously a member of the Dresslerville Community Council and the Washoe Tribal Council. So I'm here today to give a little bit of a talk on the history of the tribe. I may talk about some modern day issues, but mostly we're going to talk about who we were as a people pre-contact and some of our traditions that are still alive and well in our communities. So one of the big things that I always like to mention when I start these talks is that we're still here today. We're still a present people and a modern people. We are in a different form than we were pre-contact. We now have modern day governments and businesses. In the Carson Valley, I believe we're the second largest employer in the entire valley. We have a clinic and a health center. We have our own tribal courts and police departments and so on and so forth. And so we do our best to govern ourselves. We are considered a sovereign nation, so we are equal to states, not under states' control. And it's really important for tribes and for people outside of our communities to understand who we are and have that respect for us as a government and a political entity. So the Washoe tribe is the original people of the Tahoe Basin and surrounding areas. We talk about our homeland as extending from Tuolumne Meadows and Mono Lake in the south, all the way up to Susanville in the north. And then we go into the Sacramento Valley on the west side and into the Great Basin to the east of us. So we once had an expansive homeland with Da'au at the center of it. Today, many people refer to Da'au as Lake Tahoe, and I always like to tell the story that Tahoe is just a mispronunciation of our word for lake. So when we say Lake or Lake Tahoe or Lake Da'au, we're saying Lake. And the same is for Mount Talak. So Talak, our word for mountain is Dalak. So the phrase Mount Talak or Mount Dalak is a mountain in our language. So it's kind of funny to us that these things happen and they stick, and this is now a world-renowned place, even though it's a mispronunciation of a Washoe word. So the Washoe tribe has been here for at least 12,000 years minimum, according to archaeological resources. But me and my sister had this discussion recently because she works at the UC Davis Research Center. And so one of our stories about the creation of Lake Tahoe actually describes a tsunami that occurred here. And so in this story, Poetsley and Damalali, which are two brothers, and they occur in a lot of our stories, we're camping towards the southern side of what's currently the lake, and there used to be a stream that went through this area. And in this story, it's kind of a part of an odyssey, so to speak, where Poetsley and Damalali go through quite a few different trials and tribulations, and all of these stories occur around our homelands. So in this specific story, Poetsley is the older brother, and he tells Damalali to go out and look for deer, to go and scare these deer towards him so that he could ambush them. And Damalali, being the younger brother, is a little mischievous. So he goes out and he starts wandering off, and he's not listening to his brother anymore. And he comes upon this creek, and at this creek there was a rock kind of on the side or in the middle of it. And in our language we say metsunge, and there was a metsunge laying there on that rock sunbathing. And so metsunge kind of roughly translates, or it's described in English as being a water baby, but that doesn't really kind of talk about the totality of this being. So I prefer to use the term metsunge, and that's what I'll use in the story. So this Metsunge was laying here sunbathing, and Damalali came on and snuck up on him, and he saw that he had long, beautiful hair. And so from different storytellers, they say that either Poetsley was bald or that Poetsley's wife was bald. And so Damalali got this bright idea that he was going to go in and he was going to take the hair from Metsunge and he was going to give it to his brother as a gift. And so he went down there and he tried to sneak up on this Metsunge and he grabbed a rock and he was going to club it. and knock him unconscious. But instead, they got in a big fight and they fought all the way around the edge of the lake. And they say that they fought kind of counterclockwise, so from the Taylor Creek area, heading over to Deck with Bush, up to Incline, around over to the other side of the lake, and then back to Taylor Creek. And during this fight, during this battle, each of these places are given a name. So all of these places come to being at that time. Each of the streams and tributaries, Cave Rock, Deck, Bush, all of these places come to being, and all of these places are named after the events and resources that are there. So when they get back to Taylor Creek, or where Taylor Creek is today, finally Damolali gets the upper hand. He clubs Metsungay and he grabs the hair and he begins to run up the hill towards where his brother is camped at. And as he's doing so, that Metsungay wakes up and starts to follow him. And behind that Metsungay, the water levels continue to rise. And so Poetili, looking down and seeing what's happening, he tells his brother to throw the hair back, to give it back before you drowned us all. And Damolali, being mischievous and wanting to give this gift to his brother, he takes a few strands and he throws it behind him, and he continues to run back to the camp. And so Metsungay stops for a little bit, gathers the hair, the water kind of slows and it's rising, and then it continues to rise until it gets all the way to the top. And so at this point, Damolali comes to his brother Poetili, and he says, "Here, I brought this for you." And Poetili, being the wise older brother, tells him, "I don't want it. Give it back before you drowned us all." And so finally, Damolali, seeing the trouble that he's caused and seeing the rising water levels behind him, throws back all of the hair, and the water begins to recede. Although the water doesn't go back to where it is naturally. The water goes back to the lake level as we know today. And it also created all of the lakes in the areas as well. And so in our creation story, we say that this is how the lake came to be, that this battle between Metsungay and Damolali occurred, and that all of these events happened. And so my sister works at the UC Davis Research Center, and they always talk about the damming of the lake and the subsequent tsunami and so on and so forth. And it's really cool, and it's kind of interesting too to see the science behind this event, right? And so they talk about it as occurring between 9,000 and 14,000 years. And it's really cool to see that data too, because it also talks about our existence possibly being longer as far as the 14,000 year mark versus the 10 to 12,000 years, which archaeological records represent. We as a people say that we've always been here, and to be able to see these events on our land and describe them in our creation stories is a cool way of kind of talking about it. So whenever we take our kids to the UC Davis Research Center, we go out and learn about the kind of geological and seismic activity of this place, we're always reminded of our existence here and our creation stories. And so our kids are always quick to say, yeah, that's maybe what science says, but we know what really happened. We know Poetili and Damolali caused this kind of thing. And it's super empowering for our communities, for our stories to be told, for our oral histories to be carried on, because oftentimes there was so much loss. So I think that that's an important story to talk about in the Tahoe Basin, and really to set up kind of this idea of all of our place names and all of our knowledge of place. So a lot of our place names around the lake are related to specific resources or events that occurred. So for example, near Taylor Creek, there's a creek called Debalelek, which means the running red water, and this is describing of Metsungay being battered and bruised and bleeding into the water. We call Taylor Creek actually Daugashashuwata, which means clear creek. It means the water is clear there. And then we call, I believe, I can't think of the English name, but Atabi is right there near State Line. And this is a place that describes fish spawning. So it would have been a place that we went throughout the year during spawning season to gather fish. A lot of our place names are named after these events or resources. And one of the cool things about it is that each family, like the family bands within the Washoe tribe, were tied to these places. So the same family would return to the same area year after year, building upon the resources that were developed there that already existed and cultivating those so that there was always more than enough for the people here. Whenever I do a talk in the Tahoe Basin, I make sure to mention the story from my Uncle Wesley Barber. And in one of the Forest Service documents that was published in the area, he talks about his grandfather, Tom Barber, telling him that in the Tahoe Basin, you were more likely to run out of firewood than you were to run out of food. And to me, it's a really powerful statement to think about, that we cultivated resources or had so much abundance of resources here that we were more likely to run out of the dead and down fuel that causes forest fires today than we were to run out of the food in which we used to survive. It also talks about this idea that Washoe people manage land in such a way in such a way that there was no dead and down wood here, that there were no overloads of fuels that would cause fires. And it goes back to our land management practices as a whole. Washoe people in the Tahoe Basin and surrounding areas used to use fires. Kind of today it's talked about as a cultural burn, but more so than anything, our elders say that they used to start a fire when they would leave a camp at a particular time during the year. That fire would burn in one direction and they would walk in the other direction. And there was never a worry about that fire being destructive because they took such good care of the land. Just over here in the Truckee side, out by Donner Lake where the Donner Party, all of that occurred, right? We have stories of Washoe people living there throughout the entire year because there was enough firewood to sustain them in the winters. They actually say that the snow was so deep, all you could see was the top of their Galas Dongal during the winter and the smoke coming out of it, which is a really cool thing to think about. The snow being so deep and families so close-knit and together, and staying there together all throughout the year. For the rest of the tribe, our Hungalelti, our Bawaloo, our Donglelti people, there was often traveling throughout the seasons. And so for Bawaloo people, the people of the valley, the people that I come from, we talk about spending our winter months down in the valley after gathering resources. And it kind of sets up this idea of travel. It's described as a seasonal transhumance, but again, I've always been told by our elders that it wasn't something that was done just because the seasons changed, but we always did things when the time was right. So there's this idea in our communities, and it's always a joke when we show up to meetings late. We say, "Oh, I'm sorry I'm late. I was running on Indian time." And, we always get a good laugh out of it because everybody knows that's how things go. But I'm always reminded by our elders that Indian time isn't showing up late, that Indian time is being there at the right time. Being there when resources are ready, medicines are blooming, and so on and so forth, so that we don't miss out on those times. And my Uncle Wes again once told me that if you were late, that you were going to be hungry and you were probably going to starve. So it was important to be there at the right time when the seasons change, when things were ready. And now, because of climate change and so on and so forth, that's a little bit more unpredictable than it was previously. But we always knew when the seasons were changing because of certain things happening. So for example, just last month in October and September is usually pine nut gathering season for us. So single leaf pinyon pine is a species that's kind of endemic to the Great Basin. The range kind of stretches from here, Virginia City area and just past Susanville, down through Mono Lake area. And then I actually believe that there's a patch of single leaf pinyon pine that grows right near Temecula. It's kind of a separate one. It's on its own. It doesn't have a surrounding forest that it's connected to. It's surrounded by different species of plants. But the cool thing about this is that this was an incredibly important plant for us during the fall seasons, and a lot of our culture was built around it. So they always say that during pine nut season, you know when the pine nuts are going to be ready because rabbit brush would bloom. So those yellow flowers that a lot of people have allergies towards, when rabbit brush is blooming, it means it's time to start getting ready to go gather pine nuts. Today it's a lot different. We'll see it in different areas. So from Washoe Valley to the Carson Valley, some may be in bloom, some may not be. With heat and climate change in general, we see that even within the same area, so just driving down the highway, for example, some of these plants may be in bloom and some of them may still be dormant. So it's a little messed up today, and it's harder to kind of predict those things as we once would. But during the fall time, we would all gather in the pine nut hills, the pine nut allotments today, and we would have our pine nut dance, our Dagum Boom Sabai. So this is one of our big ceremonies throughout the year where a lot of our communities come together. Because a lot of the time we were out in our family camps in smaller groups. But for this ceremony in particular, they used to send runners in all directions. And those runners would carry a strip of leather or rawhide with 4 knots tied into it. And so as they delivered this message, everyone would untie the knot as the days go. And on the 4th day, they knew that the dance was going to start and it was time to gather and be there. So everyone would come together. We're not as tough as we used to be. Nowadays, we only dance one night. So we dance from sunset to sunrise. But a long time ago, 50, 60 years ago, they used to dance for 4 days straight. So they would dance all night, they would go out and gather pine nuts, they would bring those back in their cones before they open, and they would cook them underground. One of the cool things about this ceremony is that this was for the entire community. So when they would go out and gather those pine nuts and bring them back and cook them, they were evenly distributed to everybody. And then after that ceremony is over, everyone would go to their own family lands. And in our language, our property or private property in the Pine Nut Hills is called our mosh, Dimash, for example, would be my pine nut lands. And that word is really cool because it relates to another word in our language. For our face, we would say Dimash. So Dimash, Dimash. The M is a little bit more nasalized than the word for your face, but the idea and the teaching there is that our lands are an extension of ourselves, and so we treated and cared for our pine nut lands like we would care for our own face, like we would care for our own body, and treat that land as an extension of ourselves, not separate from people, but a part of us. And so the same ideology is there too, right? That for people, we're also a part of these ecosystems and not separate from them, kind of like we've done to ourselves today by creating cities and so on and so forth that separate ourselves from land. When we think about it from an indigenous perspective, everything that we did impacted our surroundings, whether that's driving a vehicle or picking a pine nut. All of these things have an impact, and we have a responsibility to make sure that things aren't done in a wrong way. So we would gather our pine nuts. We would send everybody to their family camps at that point, and everyone would begin to go and cultivate and care for their own pine nut groves. Today, it's a lot more difficult because we've had a lot of fires in our pine nut allotment lands. I want to say within the last 4 years that we've had 5 separate fires in the Carson Valley in the pine nut allotments. This is specific to tribal lands, so lands that we have allotments in. One of the things for tribes is that each tribal member does have a trust land that's set aside for them and passed down from their grandparents and great-grandparents. So these lands are held in trust for us by the BIA. We don't have full ownership over them because they've become fractionalized over time, but they're still associated with the tribe. It gets really confusing for people who aren't aware of tribes or have common knowledge of tribes, because some of our land is held in trust under the tribal government as a whole. Some of it is held in trust for the individual, and the tribe has no say over those lands. Although our Hunting and Gaming Commission is able to regulate hunting on tribal lands, which is a cool thing too. So they would go out, they would gather their pine nuts, and once pine nut season was coming to an end and we have our first snows, then it's time for our rabbit drives. And so we used to gather again under the leadership of what's called a rabbit boss. In our language, we just say detumu, which means a leader. And we would go out and we would collect rabbits. And so we would use these crescent moon shaped kind of drives where it's a row of people in a semicircle there. And we would drive the rabbits to natural barricades or nets or stacks of brush that we created in order to entangle them. But one of the cool things about it is that when doing this, it was always done for the whole. So whatever was gathered was distributed evenly, and those that needed it the most were the ones that were taken care of first. Often our elders were given the most delicate parts or the most tender parts of the rabbit. So they say they used to eat their kidneys, for example. And the same thing during deer season too. You would give them the back strap. We have another word too, and I don't know the English part of this animal, but it's a tsanga mapush, which describes the tenderloins kind of along the spine on the inside of the deer. And this meat's so tender that when you pull it from the deer, it actually falls apart. And so for our elders, these were the delicate parts, and this is what was given to them in order to help maintain these community connections, but also make sure that they had more than enough to survive as well. And so a lot of our activities together were built around this idea of coming together as a community and supporting the whole. So those rabbits, after they're taken and processed, we would use all of the animal. Of course, we would eat the meat. I've even been told that if you only eat rabbit as the primary source of protein in your diet, that you do get protein poisoning because there's not enough fat on the rabbit. And so I've been told by elders that they would also eat the brains, which was kind of a delicacy, in order to avoid that and get enough fat in their system to digest that protein. They would then take the pelts, the rabbit skins, and we would cut these into strips and we would make our rabbit skin blankets. And we have 2 words for our blankets. A new rabbit skin blanket is called diolity, and that describes a fresh one that nobody has ownership of. And then we have megadalzali, which is a rabbit skin blanket that somebody has and was made for them. These were kind of our primary warmth. They would wear them around their shoulders as jackets, but they would also use them for bedding and so on and so forth. And it's really funny when I do this presentation to kids because they're always grossed out that there's rabbit fur here, that an animal died, all of these things had happened. I just want to reassure that these were humanely collected. We did order the skins online, just as anybody else would, from therabbitguy.com, if anyone's interested. And so there are different ways that we would do this, but a big part of it is that we no longer have the ability to have our rabbit drives because of private developments in the surrounding valleys. So at one time we had an expansive range of land where we could organize these. throughout the year, but his land has been developed and turned to ranches or privatized in general, and we no longer have access because of fences and private roads and property ownership. This has been a part of our culture that's slowly dwindled over the last 20 or 30 years. I want to say in the late 1980s, they did a video, and you can find it on YouTube. It's called The Rabbit Boss with Marvin Dressler, and he's kind of the last official rabbit boss for the Washoe tribe. I think he passed away in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Since then, there have been some community members who picked this up and tried to carry it on, but by no means was it as well organized or attended as it once was. And so this is something that we've had to adjust in order to keep this part of our culture alive. We no longer depend on rabbit as a big part of our diet, but it is still a delicacy for many of our elders who remember getting roasted rabbit and eating it growing up as kids. And the same can be said for our pine nuts. Well, it was once a large staple of our diet. Now it's more so a delicacy, and over the last couple of years, mostly because of drought and the intense heat waves that we felt in the Carson Valley and the pine nut allotments, we haven't had a good harvest for about 3 years of doggo. So it's been a long time. We actually had a tribal member come by our office the other day and drop off a bunch of pine nuts that he had gotten, but he went out and bought them from Rayleigh's because that was the only place that he could find them. And it's really sad because a part of our culture, the ceremony, our Dogum Goom Sabayat, our pine nut dance, our coming together as community and our going out and caring for those lands, again, our mosh, our pine nut lands, is being lost because we don't have a rhyme or reason to be out there anymore. If we don't have pine nuts to gather, if we have to go to school and go to work, it makes it really tough to keep our traditions alive. But it's a big part of who we are, and it's something that we teach our kids as being important. And so in my department, we do a lot of work to make sure that we have events, that we get kids together to go out there and experience this time on land. About 10 years ago, when I first started working for the tribe, we actually had a really big issue with the Forest Service because they clear-cut 60 acres of pinyon juniper forest out by the Sweetwater Range, which is just south of Gardnerville as you go to Bridgeport there. There was a flatland area, and at this time, sage grouse was a big topic. They were discussing putting it on the endangered species list and adding additional protections for this bird. And in order to mitigate that and kind of halt those conversations of protecting this species and protecting the lands in which they reside, they decided that they were going to try to increase habitat and allow this species to roam more freely. So they clear-cut 60 acres of prime pine nut land. The only thing is that they clear-cut the wrong 60 acres. So they clear-cut 60 acres of lowland pine nut forest where elders would go. And when we talk about this, it's always the full family unit. So our grandparents and great-grandparents, all the way down to our children and grandchildren, all had a role in gathering. Some of us would watch the kids, some of us would climb the trees, some of us are cleaning the cones and cooking them, and so on and so forth. But because it's so inaccessible now, a lot of the land has been burnt or destroyed for various reasons, or in this example, clear-cut. It's really tough for our elders to go out and access these places and be a part of community as they once were. So we're always taught, respect your elders. Our elders are central to who we are, and they're people that we need to learn from. But when we have events like this where pine nut land is clear-cut, there's no longer the accessibility for our elders to go out there. It makes it really difficult to keep our traditions alive. The other part of this conversation too is that there's no data to back up the clear-cutting of pinyon juniper forest in support of sage grouse. And even more so, if that species is endangered, it truly needs these protections. So to mitigate that by clear-cutting an area and increasing habitat isn't really resolving the problem. It's just destroying another part of a people's culture. So in some of these meetings, it got really heated, and a lot of the elders that I saw speak were trying to express that while this species is important, we're also going extinct. By destroying these lands that are important to us, you're taking away parts of our cultures and our opportunities to engage intergenerationally with our youth, and you're destroying who we are as Indigenous people, whether that be Washoe or that be Botlel Paiute people too, because they were also impacted by this clear cutting. And so while we see a lot of this happening in our communities, it's also an opportunity for us to kind of re-engage about saving our language and culture. And one of the coolest things for our tribe specifically is that our language is a language isolate. So our language isn't spoken by any other tribe in the world. We are classified as a member of the Hokan language family. I always say this, but this is a kind of hypothesized language family that was made up because nobody wanted to do the work to actually understand where all of these our languages in California come from. So what they did is for all of these languages that didn't fit into these nice family trees that they created, they threw them in this group called the Hokan language family. Since then, at least 5 languages within that family have been identified as language isolates unrelated to any other in the world. So again, this doesn't only mean that our language is incredibly rare or unique, but it also means that our worldview, the way in which we see the world through our language, is unique to our people. Our words and our language itself, we describe as coming from our homelands. And so it isn't something that man created, but was truly shaped by our ecosystems, our geographical areas, and who we are as a people. So our customs and all of those sorts of things. It's something we don't talk about a lot outside of our communities, but when we talk about the loss of our language, we talk about it as never really being gone. If we know how to listen and learn, we can go back onto the land and learn these things. So when we talk about language and culture as potentially being gone in the future, we also have this understanding from a very traditional perspective that it won't be gone as long as we learn how to listen again, as long as we learn how to be humans and not people. So again, we set up this distinction of what is our responsibility within our homelands. Our responsibility as Washoe people is to care for this place. We can't go to the Great Basin, we can't go to the Great Plains or the East Coast and still be Washoe people because our knowledge is tied to this place. Our creation stories, all of our histories are tied to this place here specifically. And so this place is where Washoe people are and where Washoe people are meant to be. A couple months ago in July, our tribal council declared a state of emergency because of the loss of elder speakers. During the pandemic, it hit our communities really hard. So a lot of our tribal members did their best to stay home, but it was kind of unavoidable. And I know a lot of us lost loved ones or friends and so on and so forth, but it hit our elders really hard. And so during the pandemic, we lost at least 10 elder speakers, some of them more fluent than others, but towards the end there, we lost one speaker who was actually one of my teachers at the immersion school when I was a kid. I believe she was in her late 80s. And so it was a really powerful thing for our tribal council to say, we need to not only declare a state of emergency for COVID as a pandemic, but we need to talk about this, our loss of language as being so critical to who we are, that it's a state of emergency for us. And so our tribal council declared this state of emergency, which means increased resources for our department and support from our tribal administration. And it's been a big boost for us and kind of re-energized the entire tribe to value our language and to learn to be speakers. One thing we're always reminded of is that we don't want to talk about our language from this deficit perspective of if we don't do anything today, it won't be here for the future. We really want to empower our people to take ownership over it and know that the work that they do today is going to mean that our language is alive for the future. And so trying to reframe those things and making sure that we're working from a perspective of strength is important to who we are and important to our cultural values. A lot of times when people pass in our communities, we say, you never talk about that person again. So again, historically, when someone would pass, if they lived in the Galis Dangal, they would burn that house and get rid of any kind of item associated with that person who had just passed. And there was a lot of kind of taboos around death. So we say that you let that person go, you don't talk about them because you don't want to keep them here. You want to allow them to travel, whether that's to an other side, that's a beautiful place, or whether that's just them returning to the earth. I've been told both by different elders in our communities, but it's important to allow that person to rest. And so today we have a lot of different things, right? We have photos in our houses of loved ones. And so when I was growing up as a kid, our elders always said that at least for 1 year, you don't say that person's name and you put all of those photos away so that that person can travel, so that we as a community can heal from our losses. And that way, when that year is over, we can have that celebration of life to honor that person, to remember them for all of the good things that they brought to community. And it's important for us in all things that we do to have that frame of reference, that we allow things to rest, that we return to those places when it's the right time. We allow those things to heal. And so one of the things too with us as Washoe people is that traveling throughout our homelands during the seasons, that also gave land a chance to rest. So when we were doing burning in the Tahoe Basin at the end of the summers, that land could heal during the winter. But today we see with all of the tourism, all of the traffic and so on and so forth, that land's never given this opportunity to heal. I thought it was really cool during the pandemic that we saw ozone heal. I mean, I remember growing up in the 90s and they said ozone's gone, nothing's happening, right? It's never coming back. But we saw this ozone heal during the pandemic. We saw endangered species return to places that they hadn't been for hundreds of years kind of thing. And we saw land return to a natural state a state that it was kind of always meant to be without human disturbance or interruption. And so one of our values here, and something that we've talked about a lot with all of the sustainability planning that's happening in Tahoe, is how do we let these places rest? We always come here during the summer for everyone to flock to the beaches, and during the winter time, everybody heads to the ski resorts. So this land here never gets a chance to rest, it never gets a chance to heal. None of the species here that are important to this place are ever given a break. For us, after the winter season, one of the big things is we say we have a couple of names for our moons, and some of these come from modern day creations. So we don't have a name for each month traditionally, but one of the names that we definitely had was during the months of February. Excuse me. We would call it Del Yuli Gumdibet, which means the ghost moon. And they talk about this month of February being really tough on the tribe, because if people didn't gather their acorns and so on and so forth, we wouldn't have necessarily had enough to survive during those times. So we definitely had a name for that end of winter time, Del Yuli Gumdibet. But also during the early spring and snow melting, it was a time of renewal. And so they describe it as Washoe people returning to the Tahoe Basin when snow first starts melting. These are described as younger, more able-bodied people cutting trail into the Tahoe Basin for children and elders to follow. But I'm always key to remind people that while this description from ethnologists and anthropologists may be somewhat accurate, it isn't fully encompassing all of the experiences of Washoe people. So not everybody returned to the lake as soon as snow started melting. Not everybody spent time at the lake during these summer months, because a lot of time people spent time in the valleys, taking care of their winter homes, gathering the other resources available, caring for these places, or going in different directions to gather different things. One of the things that I've heard recently at some of the talks that I've attended and not presented at was, for example, describing other tribes coming to the Tahoe Basin to trade with Washoe people. Now, in our oral histories and our communities, we say that that never happened. Washoe people were around the Tahoe Basin. There may have been visitors who traveled here sparingly, but it wasn't a big gathering place for other tribes. The reason that I want to bring this up is because we get this from a lot of our Paiute people in the Great Basin who try to claim the Truckee River, which is center again to Washoe territory, and bring their voices into the conversation, in which it also minimizes our voice as the only people who were here prior to contact. So the Tahoe Basin, being the central place to our traditions and our homes, was a place that most only Washoe people visited prior to contact. Now this is of course changed in more modern times where everybody is able to access this place uninterrupted. So during these times of the summer, in the early spring would be a time to go get the cutthroat trout when they're spawning. They say that cutthroat trout usually only spawns when the temperatures around the Tahoe Basin are cold enough for them to go upstream. And so this is usually during early spring when the snow's melting. The other thing, and it's not so common here anymore, but we used to have matoshahu, it's called a whitefish that was also present in the Tahoe Basin and surrounding areas. And they say that this fish was so abundant that you literally could walk out into the shallows with your basket and throw them onto the shores. The cool thing about that is that they actually spawn in the shallows. So during their spawning season, they're present on the edges of the lake. You can see an abundance of whitefish there. And so Washoe people would time our gathering to those seasons when these fish were traveling naturally. The other thing here too, though, one of our big teachings is that you always leave more than you take, and you only take what you need. So it's described as if there were 7 fish in a barrel, you would only take 3 so that those other 4 could propagate and there would be an abundance of fish for the future. What happened in the late 1800s is that commercial fishing started here in the Tahoe Basin. They didn't respect these protocols and they overfished the cutthroat trout. So by 1940, I believe, there were no cutthroat trout in the Tahoe Basin. I have talked to quite a few scientists and researchers, and they say that there was definitely some cutthroat trout here, but the population was so decimated that it was they were unable to track or know that there were any fish here. So again, one of the things too that happened at this time is right away, local newspapers turned around and they said Washoe people are to blame for this problem. Washoe people shouldn't be allowed to sell fish in the local cities like Virginia City and Reno. And we should, since we can't stop Washoe people from fishing, then we can at least stop non-natives from buying the fish from them. This again is dismissive of the commercial fishing that occurred here, the logging that occurred that choked the Truckee River and surrounding areas and so on and so forth. And it places the blame on indigenous people, who are the people that had stewarded these places for thousands of years without any destruction or loss of habitat or species. To us, it's something that we still deal with today because so much of the perspective of indigenous peoples during early contact shaped these relationships historically. So Washoe people are still viewed as part of the problem and not part of the solution, although that's changing. We're seeing now with Forest Service, BLM, and in general, forest managers and stewards wanting to access traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, and learn from the indigenous peoples of this place how they can better manage lands and take care of these areas for the future. So, for example, on the California side, they've seen the suppression of fire is now causing drastic forest fires, right? So how do we integrate forest and land management practices that will actually create healthy ecosystems? We're also seeing, of course, that these monoculture forests that were replanted after the removal of timber from the Tahoe Basin occurred to support mining and logging, that these forests aren't healthy, that species that are important to the Tahoe Basin aren't living in these monoculture forests because they need a diversity of species in order to survive. So a lot of times today we're fixing the mistakes of Western settlers who viewed land as an object to be developed versus indigenous people who viewed this land as a part of ourselves. So during the summer months, again, it was a big time gathering around the edges of the lake. We have some of our traditional games that were played. We have a few games. One is called Sagayak, and it's like field hockey. We would play with long sticks, and we call it rabbit, but it was like a long piece of cloth or leather that's tied up, and they would use those sticks to knock it into a goal. We always laugh in our communities because Sagayak is a women's game. Men aren't supposed to play Sagayak, and we say it's because we're not tough enough. Like our women are out there hip checking each other and whacking each other with sticks and that sort of thing. And so while this is traditionally a women's game, we still keep that tradition alive and we honor and respect our women, and we don't enter those spaces as men because that's not a space that's meant to be for us. Within the last 6 years, one of our language teachers, Lisa Enos, started an event in the Carson Valley called Washoe Traditional Pastimes, which is we also call our Washoe Olympics. So we play our Sagayak, our Beloyabi, Hinayaugi, Itmalit, Gumlalit, and so on and so forth, which were a lot of our traditional games. Some of these games are, I actually have a set here. So some of these games are like simple games. This one is actually we would call like a dice game. So using elderberry staves, elderberry that we would cut. We have a blank side and then a side that we might draw on or design. And usually we would roll these. And if you got an even number up and an even number down, so equal, usually we play with 6, not 4. But if you had equal, then you would get 1 point. If you had all of them facing up, then you would get 2 points kind of thing. And the game would continue in that way. Some of our other games, like Hinayaugi, is a game that was played across tribes in the area. So it's something that we would do with other tribes as well during gatherings and so on and so forth. Today, Hinayaugi is called hand game or stick game. And it's an old school gambling game where there's 2 teams set up. We hide bones and we use sticks to guess each other and try to figure out where the marked bone or the unmarked bone is, depending on where you're at. From the California side eastward, most tribes play with the unmarked bone is the one that you're trying to guess. California is the only place that I've been where they say that you guess the marked bone. So that was the distinction on that side of the hill that they've always done. That was different than a lot of the other tribes around here. But a lot of these games were games that we talk about as developing skills important to our survival, whether that's dexterity, humility, humbleness, and so on and so forth, or also our kind of physical skills as far as running and throwing and hunting and so on, so forth. So these were social games that were played throughout the year. Today we only have one event where we do this. We bring all 4 of our tribal communities, our reservations together, and our youth compete against each other. It's a really fun time for us to be indigenous and celebrate our culture without the influences of the outside world, and just a chance for our kids to be kids. We don't have to talk about how much we've lost or how much work we need to do, but we can come together and share in these things. And again, remind our kids how important it is to have fun, to be social, and really to be, to slow things down and live kind of an older, simpler life. So in our creation story, when Washoe people are first created, we say that there was Nintishu, old woman, and she was winnowing cattail seeds, tule seeds. And so she was taking these seeds and she was separating the chaff and the fluff from them. And then she was taking the seeds that were remaining and she put them in a ketchup in a jug. And so in this jug, she filled it with seeds, and then she called Coyote here. In our language, we say Gewe. She called Gewe to this place, and she gave him this mission to bring people here to empty them in the center of our homeland so that we would begin to grow. And she told him explicitly, no matter what happens, don't open this jug before you get there. And so, of course, Coyote in a lot of indigenous cultures is a trickster, he's mischievous, he doesn't listen. The list goes on for how bad this guy can be. In our language, we say he's Napa. Napa in our language means like naughty, a bad person, but not in a bad way, kind of like being an evil person, but mischievous, naughty, so on and so forth. So Gewe being Napa, he promised to Nintishu that he would do exactly as she said, scout's honor kind of thing. And so he began on his journey. And as he came to this place, he started to hear the jug move. He started to hear voices in there. There was arguing and fighting. And eventually it got so bad, they say that his ears started to buzz and he couldn't take it anymore. And so he decided that he was going to just open it up and take one quick peek to see what was happening in there. And as he did that, the majority of the seeds flew from that place. And I've heard, again, a couple of versions depending on who the storyteller is, but they say that those seeds went to the sky, returned to the place in which they came from, or they say that those seeds begin to grow into the surrounding tribes of this place. And so we always say from this that Washoe people are only a few, and this is why all of the tribes that are around us are so much larger, because Gewet messed up early on. And so he quickly closed it and he continued it on his journey. Again, it continued to buzz and hurt his ears, and so a couple more times he opened it up. And by the time he got to our homelands, there was only a handful of seeds left. And so finally he opens this ketchup, this jug, and he pours these seeds out, and they begin to grow into Washoe people. And at this time, Nintishu, she calls in a storm, and they say that all of our spring storms always come from the south, especially in the Carson Valley, that they always come from the south. All of our thunderstorms come from that direction. And she told this storm, Gamosithaya, Gamagapaya, which means soak the land, drench the land, so that everything would begin to grow. And then she turned to all of the plants and animals and medicines and all of these things, and she told them to grow, to provide food for our people, to provide medicines for us when we're sick, and so on and so forth. And then she turned to us as Washoe people, and she told us that it's our responsibility here to make sure that all of these things will also be here for the future. So that our responsibility is to be the stewards of this place, to care for this place and make sure that nothing is lost, that all of this diversity and all of the things that we enjoy as far as natural beauty aren't changed. And so from our very creation, our role here has been to take care of this place, to honor this place, and to understand that it's not our right to destroy or develop, but to maintain and expand upon it so that there will always be more than enough for us and for everything else that lives here. The last thing that I just wanted to touch on, because I know we're getting kind of close, is some of the archaeology around the area. So a lot of times, and especially here, you see bedrock mortars around the area. We call these long. These are our grinding rocks. A couple of the plants that were most commonly ground are our acorns, our malum, and then, as I mentioned earlier, our pine nuts, our tagum. One of the things with acorns specifically is that we would have to travel to the Sacramento Basin, or at least over to the other side of the Sierras into the foothills and gather these. And they say for acorn, for black oak, that you have to actually give it a year before you grind it up and make anything out of it, before it becomes a food source. So they would bring these back to our family camps here in the Tahoe Basin and surrounding areas. They would set up caches. I haven't seen a cache in the Tahoe Basin, but I would assume that there may still be some available. Usually what these were are big stacks of rock with mud and earth and other things interwoven. And then at the center, there would be acorns or pine nuts or those sorts of things. I have come across caches in the pine nut allotments, which again are places that were stewarded or Washoe people had lived up until like the 1940s. So quite a bit longer time there. In the Tahoe Basin, it was the late 1800s, early 1900s, in which land was developed and we no longer had a place to come here anymore. So what we would do again is store these for a year. They would then the following year come back to these caches, open them up, put them in their bedrock mortars, You crack the shell, you clean off, there's actually like a film on the inside around the acorn itself. You remove that skin that's in there, and then you grind it up and you leach it. I was in college at the University of New Mexico when a researcher came to our class, and she had done a lot of her work on the California side. And one of the big things that they hear over there is that acorn has no nutrition, and that people who eat acorn have a poor diet kind of thing, and then they have all of these diseases that occur after a poor diet. Again, this is kind of brainwashing or propaganda that was used against indigenous people, because in her research, she said that acorns have fats, carbohydrates, and proteins all in one. So instead of being something that didn't give you any nutrition, it's actually a superfood that has everything you need. So that we would grind these up. A lot of tribes on the California side, they make acorn soup. So they would grind it up into flour, they would leach it. You have to leach it for like an entire day, which means that you would, in a stream, you could create like a cedar bowl out of cedar boughs. You would put the acorn powder in there, and then you would allow the stream to come in and wash out the tannic acid. If you eat raw acorn that you haven't processed or let sit and cure for an entire year, then you'll ingest tannic acid. If you eat enough of it, of course, it's poisonous, but in general, it'll just make you sick. It'll make you really sick. So they would leach it, and they would make acorn soup. For Washoe people, we would actually take that a step further. So we would take our degika. Today it's described as a fancy basket, but at one time they would have been our cooking baskets. They would put the acorn in there. They would use stirring sticks, which it's a loop stirring stick. So they would take like sorry, I was hoping there might be one on the wall because there's some pretty cool artwork over here. But it's a loop stirring stick, so it's like a bow with a loop on the end, and it's tied together. And they would take that and they would take these hot rocks from the fire, and then they would put them in the baskets to boil the acorn, to cook the acorn soup. Again, for us, we would take that one step farther. We would actually make it really thick, and then we would let it cool, and then they would scoop out biscuits, and they would put it into cold water so it solidifies, and then you have an acorn biscuit that you could actually eat and carry with you versus a soup, which is a little bit more messy and hard to transport. But an important part of our food, and it's just really cool to have these conversations about endemic species, particularly acorn and pine nut and other berries here, and how important those are to our diets. How many natural occurring vitamins and minerals are in those, because we often go to the store and get these foods that are processed, that have additives to them so that we can sustain ourselves, when really everything that we need is right here within our own homelands. I remember being a kid, and side note, but I remember watching a lot of TV shows, and I really thought that quicksand was going to be a problem I had to deal with throughout my life. But in a lot of these, we also I remember watching old movies, and scurvy was something that always came up, right? Hearing this word scurvy, I just thought it was a cool word as a kid. And then to learn later on that pirates and people traveling throughout the ocean took citrus fruits and things like that with them, because that's what scurvy is caused by, right? A lack of vitamin C. So one of the cool things for Washoe people is that rosebuds, so wild rose patchouli, actually has more vitamin C in it than any other citrus fruit that you can get. So we would use those as a way to kind of cure ourselves and keep these diseases or things off of us, but also just enjoying what we have here as far as the natural bounty that this place provides for us. So these here are a couple of our grinding rocks. These are our bitsuk, so these are our pounding rocks, and these would have been used, which you'll see in the bedrock mortars, to actually pound to make the flour. And then to make the finer flour, we have these, our dimget, which are our grinding rocks to actually grind it into a nice fine powder. The other artifacts that are pretty common here that you guys may see a lot of are arrowheads. One thing I always like to mention is that, at least on public lands, our arrowheads and artifacts are protected by the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, which means that it's illegal to take artifacts from public lands or areas of that nature. Just within the last 3 years, there was actually an individual who had come to Hope Valley, and there was an old family camp there. And it's really cool because as you travel throughout the area, you'll see these rocks. Usually there'll be an overhang, and you'll see it blackened by smoke. And so it's kind of obvious that somebody had a campfire there. Most of the time, again, it's Washoe people who used to have campfires. And again, depending on the amount of smoke or how blackened that rock is, you can tell how long they've been there, how many times they've returned to that place. So there was a place in Hope Valley, and our TIPO officer, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer Daryl Cruz, took me out there. And you could see the rock blackened on one side. And then in about a 50-foot swath, probably as big as the area we're sitting in, you could see that it was dug down about 18 inches to 2 foot. But this individual had gone in there multiple times over like a 5 to 10 year period and excavated the site, taken all of the artifacts, so arrowheads, grinding rocks, all of those sorts of things, and then transported them to his home. So they eventually, and this was really just because of citizen scientists or stewards kind of thing who were in the general public, they had seen this guy do that. They reported it to the tribe. We set up game cameras to catch him the next time that he came back. And then I want to say 2 years ago, right when the pandemic started, he was actually taken to court. And I believe he had to serve 2 years in state prison because he stole so many artifacts. And we just caught him in Hope Valley for what he had taken, but he had been up and down California and the surrounding areas stealing artifacts from all kinds of archaeological sites. And one of the toughest things that happens here is that once you take that artifact from a site, it destroys the integrity of that site and it can never be put back into the place the same way that it was. So for a lot of the items that we get returned to the tribe, we can't just go back and put them in the ground just anywhere. We can't go back to that site because oftentimes people don't label them. They don't keep a true collection or record of these artifacts and where they came from. And so we end up with a warehouse or at least a storage room full of old artifacts that are temperature controlled in order to maintain their integrity. One of the big things again with NAGPRA is that it is a federal law, so people can be persecuted for this. And I know a lot of people growing up in the area have family stories of going out and hunting for arrowheads. And so what I always like to relay is that, it's great to go out and to see these things and to have that experience on land. If you find an arrowhead, pick it up and take a picture. Think about the indigenous people, the Washoe people, or whoever's homelands you might be in, and what they had used this for. Think about that experience, that maybe this arrowhead was used to hunt a deer and maybe was left behind because the shot was missed. Maybe this was a broken one that someone was working on, and right before they finished, it snapped and they decided to discard it. But each of these artifacts tell a story, and for us in our own lives, it's important to have those experiences. But when we remove these items for land, it means that future generations don't have that same opportunity. And so what we always recommend, at least from the tribe's perspective, is that when you go out and you find that arrowhead and you have that experience, to throw it under some brush or some duff or to cover it with dirt so that it's protected for the future, and that future generations come through that and remember that, think about those stories, have those same experiences that we all enjoyed growing up in our own lives. The last thing that I wanted to share here, and this actually goes back to some of our women and some of our fishing. So this is a soap root brush. They would use soap root brushes to clean our dimget, our grinding items and our log, to make sure that all of the dimget wet, which means the things that were ground were scooped up and that place was clean. So they would use these, the brushes here, to clean those areas. But this plant had multiple uses. So one of the cool things about soap root is that you can actually take it, it grows above ground like this, and then there's a bulbous plant with roots down below, and that's what becomes the handle here. But if you take that bulbous part and you put it into like a stream, it actually causes fish to be unable to absorb oxygen from the water, and so they kind of choke and they float to the surface, and it was an easy way to collect fish. The cool part about that to me is that, like today, when they're doing all of these fish studies, they use usually retinoid, I believe, which does the exact same thing, but it's a chemical that comes from South America. Or they use like electricity where they shock the stream in proximity to these fish habitats, and then they're able to collect them and pull them from the stream. And so it's something that Washoe people have been doing for thousands of years in the area, and very much so with retinoid specifically, because there are concerns about importing that, I believe, nowadays. We do have plants here locally that would do the exact same thing and be able to support that without potentially being destructive to this habitat. So every fall, we weren't able to do it for the last 2 years. Last year was because of drought, but this year it was because of miscommunication with Fish and Wildlife. But we go out to Taylor Creek and we collect kokanee salmon using traditional methods. So this fishing net was actually made for me by one of our tribal members. His daughter had her girl dance, which is one of our important ceremonies. So when a young girl comes of age and she has her first time, we have an entire ceremony to honor this young girl and to support her in her life. And so during this ceremony, This young girl fasts for 4 days. She carries with her an elderberry staff that she's supposed to keep standing throughout these 4 days and throughout the ceremony. On the 4th day, we have places in the Carson Valley. It's actually a federally recognized or registered place, historic landmark. I think it's called Itugamum Tewewe Ushash, which means the place that the girls go up for their ceremony. And so they run up this hill, and along the hill there's 4 fires. And so at the very bottom or close to the bottom, they start one, and then towards the top of the hill, they light the final fire. And these young women are told that they're supposed to run from the bottom to the top without stopping. And they say that if you stop at any point, for example, if you stop at the midway point, they say you might have difficulty as a middle-aged woman kind of thing. If you stop at the very top, that means you may have difficulty as an elder, and so on and so forth. But there's always these teachings associated with these ceremonies that are important, and a big part of it is perseverance or making through it and overcoming this. And so for our young women, they run up, they light these 4 fires, and for all of the tribal membership, and really in the Carson Valley, for anybody who can see this hill, it's a notice that there's going to be a girl dance tonight. And so then this young girl runs from Dance Hill all the way back to the Dresserville community, and when she gets there, she has her Tewewet ceremony. Part of our girl dance is that while our ceremonies aren't gender specific, there is a part that's only for women. And so our Tewewet dance is a part where only our women sing, and only our women dance as part of this ceremony. And so after that's completed, then we have a larger round dance where all of our people come together. There's still protocols here. For example, the young girl, the girl whose ceremony it is, she's not supposed to touch any of the men that are dancing or singing. She should always have her helper and another relative around her to protect her, kind of thing. But after that ceremony, then there's a washing, and then that young woman is able to eat food for the first time in 4 days. And I always think of it as a really powerful ceremony. And while our young men also have a rite of passage, by no means is it as difficult as our women's rite of passage. For our young men, it's usually about the killing of our first buck, our first deer. And there's an entire ceremony around that's done just with the men in the family. So the father, grandfather, uncles, whoever may be there present. But for our young women, it's truly a ceremony of community, that this young woman is now a part of this community, and for everyone to recognize and support her on her journey. And so this net was made for me during that girl dance. I helped to sing that night, and so it was a big honor to receive that gift. And every year since then, we've used it for our traditional fishing trip in Taylor Creek, where we go out and we're able to collect kokanee salmon using our traps, nets, and spears that are all made out of traditional fibers and materials. And so we're able to have this event every year, again, except for the last couple of years. And it's a great time to bring community together. But it also goes back to this conversation of taking care of this place and taking care of the species of this place. And so for us, with kokanee salmon, we understand that it's an invasive species that was introduced. From what I've been told, it was an accidental introduction. I believe there was like a hatchery or something like that, and then the fish escaped, right? Fish escape all the time. So this fish escaped. It reproduced in the Tahoe Basin, and now it's a landlocked salmon. It's actually detrimental to the area because it outcompetes endemic species to the lake. Again, specifically the cutthroat trout, as well as whitefish, silver trout, and so on and so forth. But for us, it's an opportunity to practice our traditions unabated. So we're able to go out there and access these places that we were once restricted from accessing. We're able to carry on this part of our culture as far as fishing on land. Whereas, again, historically, the propaganda was that Washoe people were the reason that these fish have been destroyed. And we're able to correct that narrative and have an engaging conversation with the modern stewards of this place, Fish and Wildlife and Forest Service specifically. And so it's a really cool opportunity for us to further protect the Tahoe Basin, to have some really cool conversations about what needs to be done here. I know the focus is always on water clarity, which is, of course, a key issue. But we also need to think about Tahoe Basin as a whole, to be able to give this place a rest, to be able to allow it to return to a natural state, to give it sort of the personhood and respect that it deserves as a living being itself. And so the one thing that I want to leave you guys with before